Hello, I'm Alistair McIntyre, the web publisher of Electric Scotland, and today I'd like to talk about the Scots Diaspora. I genuinely believe that people in the Scots Diaspora know that they're originally from Scotland, but I also believe that the people in Scotland don't really understand the Scots Diaspora. There seems to be quite a big attitude over in Scotland. If you're Scots, you've got to live in Scotland. Well, I want to kind of tell you about the Scots Diaspora in this wee video I'm making. Let me take you back to the Jacobite Rebellion period. This is between 1715 and 1745 in Scotland. In the wee communities of Auchterarder and Crieff, the Jacobite army there and the clans decided that they had to waste these lands. Why do they want to waste the lands? Because the king's army was coming after them. So they thought, well, if we burn all the houses and burn all the feed and everything, then when the king's army gets to this spot, there's no place to shelter them, there's no place to get feed for their horses or anything. Therefore they'll stop and they won't come any further. So the order went out, burn the lands. Now this was nothing that was well organised. I mean, you think if they were going to do that, maybe they would go and they give everyone a several days notice that they were going to do this, and they would help them get their possessions out of their houses and arrange to take them somewhere nice so they could be sheltered. And bearing in mind when this particular event on, there was a very severe snowstorm in that area at the time. So what happened? Chap, chap, chap at the door. Get out, we're burning your house. You can't do that. We're already burning it, the roof's already going. Up to you, leave or get burned. And quite often, they ran out of the house in the clothes they stood up in. And by the time they got out of the house was just collapsing in, burning. But the trouble is they did it to all the other houses in the wee village. Where did you go for shelter? They couldn't care less. They burnt the house. That was their job. That's what they were told to do. Burn the houses. They went and burned the crops and the barns and everything like that. And they slaughtered a lot of the cattle, and the army used that for food and so forth. Didn't leave anything behind. Didn't even leave a milk cow, so there'd be some milk for the family or anything. Now just think about it. Today you're living in Scotland, you're renting a nice wee house somewhere, you're very cosy, you're very comfortable. Someone chaps on the door and says, you better get out, we're just burning your house down. What? You can't burn our house down? Well son, the roof's already on fire. Up to you, they just walk away. Well, you kind of grab what you can and out. But because they've burnt all the houses in the area, where do you go for shelter? Remember in those days, no social security. No one needed to come down to give you a safe shelter or anything. Out. That's where you are. Can't do that. Done it, son. You see, you don't realise what happened back in those days. Same with the Highland clearances. The Highland clearances, the chiefs decided after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, their power had been broken. The power of the chief was based on the number of men he could bring to arms. Well, there was no point in bringing anyone to arms because, I mean, he couldn't do that anymore. So all of a sudden, his big power base had gone. What is he going to do? Well, the only thing he's got is his lands. No point looking after the people anymore because there's no benefit to him in doing that. So they turfed them out of their houses, just like the guy that did ordered all these wee villages at Crieff and Auchterarder and so forth burnt. They just burnt the houses around them. So what did all the people that were on the beaches getting some shellfish for some and stuff like that, whatever they could scrape up, maybe driftwood would build them a wee kind of shelter or something. That was a really miserable existence. Why would you not want to leave Scotland if there was a promise of a better life? In some respects, it's like someone in Aberdeen. Their family have lived in Aberdeen for generations. But all of a sudden the head of the household gets offered a really cracking good job at double the salary he's getting at the moment, but he has to move to Glasgow. Oh well, I'll move to Glasgow. So the whole family's moved to Glasgow. So are they now Glaswegians or are they still Aberdonians? But certainly if the kids grow up, they'll see themselves as being Glaswegians. But they may well remember that their family originally came from Aberdeen. But it's exactly the same thing. I decided that there's a much better opportunity in Argentina, so we moved to Argentina. Are we now Argentines or are we still Scots? Well, when the next generation's grown up, they see themselves as being Argentines. So, but they still remember the folks came from Scotland. Exactly the same thing. It's just that you're now outside of Scotland itself. But the same applies. Are you a Glaswegian or you're an Aberdonian? And then, despite all these forced exodus of Scots to other parts of the world, there was a lot of planned exodus because people could see major opportunities. I'll give you for instance. A lot of the tenant farmers in the Ayr area of Scotland. Now bearing in mind in these days, the big landowners owned the land, therefore you could not own the land, you could only rent it. And of course, as the landowners were getting greedy and wanted to get more money, they would increase the rents. And it was getting to the point where all these little farmers were really struggling to make ends meet. So this group of tenant farmers called a meeting. And they decided at that meeting they would form the Scotch American Land Company. And the purpose of raising it was that they hired 2 surveyors who were going to go to America to see if they could find land that they could all go over together, purchase and develop their own farms that they would own, not rent, but own. And so these surveyors went over, they went all over America, eventually found a place called Reigate in Vermont, and they found the person that owned the land who gave them a great deal, and they bought the land. They bought sufficient land so that every tenant farmer in the Scotch American Land Company could have a really good sized farm. And as a result, they all moved over there. Today they're Americans. But I bet you a lot of people in Reigate remember that they originally had come from Scotland. And then in another example, because of the wars and everything going on, Ulster was in a terrible state. And so there was major incentives to send people over there to take up the land and to improve things. And so a lot of Scots, especially in the lowlands of Scotland, but some Highlanders as well, they moved over to take over lands in Ulster. Called the Ulster Plantations. And they bought good swatch of land, and it was good farming land and so forth. But of course, a couple of generations after they moved, maybe 3 generations, they were having the same kind of problem. Things were unsettled, sectarian violence and all kinds of things. I mean, mostly it was Presbyterian over in Ulster. But the potato famine hit. Obviously a lot of problems running their plantations over there. So in a mass, a lot of them moved to America. It's why you get the Scots-Irish in America. But they originally come from Scotland to Ulster. Now they move, we call them Ulster Scots. In America they call them Scots-Irish. But if you actually look at what the Scots-Irish achieved when they went to America, again, that's just an amazing story. I mean, John Wayne, if he goes far enough back, he's of Scots ancestry. Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone. I mean, these people all originally had Scots ancestry. And when you look at what these Scots did when they got to these new lands of theirs, I mean, that's just a fabulous story. I mean, people in Scotland should be so proud of what their ancestors did that went out into the world. I mean, I often talk about what was pioneering all about. And in Canada, you know, I learned a bit about that. In that, yes, they were given lands, and a lot of the lands they were given were just trees. So to build their farms, they literally had to cut all these trees down and get rid of the stumps to make the fields that they could now plant and make lots of money from. But that was brutally hard work. Brutally hard work. In fact, I don't think people of today could do it, because I don't think we're nearly as tough as we used to be in the old days. But that's what they did. They went out and carved out the lands. And if you think about it, almost the first public building they put up for their community was a church. The Scots and Scots-Irish literally took the church with them. But as well as that, the church was also a school. I mean, eventually they had a separate schoolhouse. But in these early days, these were the schools as well. And if you look all over the place, you'll find that the Scots built their churches. They often founded the big universities of today. Or if they didn't found them personally, they usually made major contributions towards them. They were very keen on the church and on education. But these people were also merchants. I mean, I'll give you an example. When you're looking about Canada, you must know about the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company owned land that was the equivalent of the whole of Europe. That's how extensive their lands were. They were a huge operation. Yet it was principally Scots that were the head and the driving force behind the Hudson's Bay Company. You've just got to be hugely proud of these people. They opened up a land. They explored it. They found ways to navigate around it. They built settlements through building forts for trading and everything. They built whole communities right across Canada. And when you look at Canada, one of the biggest building feats around was the Canadian Pacific Railway. But that almost never got built. There was a lot of political arguing to and fro about that. And in fact, London attempted to make sure that they couldn't raise any money to build it. So on one hand, you had John A. Macdonald, a Scot, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, fought politically for it. James Douglas, the Governor of British Columbia, who was a Scots Jamaican as it happens, fought for it. And Lord Strathcona, who was another Scot, he raised the money for it. And the chief engineer, or the chief surveyor for the whole project, were also Scots. Now I tell you, every ethnic group in Canada built the railway, but right at the very top, the people that made it happen were Scots. And in fact, it was often said that the building of that railroad brought the whole of Canada together and made it a nation in its own right. And today Canada is the most successful country really in the G8. I mean, they don't have all this massive debt that every other European country and every other country had. Yes, they got some debt, but it's a hell of a lot less than every other country. Been very successful. But again, if you look at some of what the Scots did, I mean, and they were still Scots when they did this, but the first Secretary of the Department of Agriculture was a Scot in America. And he laid down a huge vision for the future of agriculture in America. And to a very large extent, that initial vision that he had and he set out to create is still there as a basis for their operation. It was him that wanted agricultural colleges built right across America for research into the best way to grow crops and to look after farmland. In fact, you know, some of the very largest ranches in America, when you think of the old American cowboy, that icon, you know, most of the really big ranches were owned by Scots and run by Scots. It's just amazing the stories that you can tell. Equally well, we moved into Europe in big ways. I mean, we've been in Europe, we've been in Poland, we've been in Germany, we've been in France. You know, in France, Scots, they had the Scots Guard there for the French kings for several centuries. The old alliance between Scotland and France was the longest alliance of any two countries in the world ever. In fact, France wouldn't be France because the English army had gone across to fight France and were winning, and winning quite successfully. And it was very obvious, if nothing happened, that England would conquer France. No question. The French king put a desperate plea to Scotland, and as a result, thousands of Scots soldiers went over to fight for France. And they beat England and in effect preserved France. I mean, that in itself is an amazing story. After the Battle of Culloden, if you look at France, you would find that there was 3 regiments of Scots in the French army. One of the most famous marshals was a Marshal MacDonald. Equally well, the most famous marshal of the Portuguese army was also a Scot, Roy Skeletor. He was marshal of the Portuguese army for about 40 years. And then you look at the generals that were generals for Russia, for Sweden, for Germany, for Prussia. I mean, they just fought all over the place. In fact, there's a famous story that the general in the Russian army were fighting the Turks, and it was decided that they would try and make a peace treaty. So they put up a massive big tent. Here's this Scots general for the Russian army. He's the negotiator for Russia, and he's speaking in Russian. On the other side is a pasha for Turkey. He's obviously talking whatever the language is in Turkey. Anyway, after extensive negotiations, they managed to conclude a peace. And when everyone had gone out the tent and it was just left for the Pasha of Turkey and this Russian general, they both started to speak in broad Scots because both of them were Scots. And they reminisced about the old days in Scotland. But you hear these kind of stories all over the place. The Scots got everywhere. They were in Outer Mongolia. In the 17th century, you find Scots in Outer Mongolia. They travelled all over the place. Hong Kong. I mean, there's big stories to be told, and I wish I could tell them, but so much of that is copyright, and I can't get permission to use it. But I can tell you, the Scots almost ran Hong Kong for a while. They were huge in Hong Kong. And so it is today. And when you come right down to it, what is amazing is that all these Scots descendants, they know they originally came from Scotland, and they're proud of it. They're very proud to be Americans. They're very proud to be Canadians. Very proud to be Argentinians. But they're also very proud of their Scottish heritage. And they do celebrate it. But Scotland doesn't seem to want to really know them. They mouth off, oh, we must get in touch with the Scots Diaspora. Fact is, they just don't. I mean, someone was saying to me the other day, there's about 300 Highland Games in North America every year. And I happen to be one of them as the official guest. This was the Jacksonville Highland Games in Florida. I think at that game, because the weather was absolutely terrible, I have to say, but they got about 20,000 people turned up. And I was staying at the house of the chairman of the games. And he did say that normally they would expect to get about 35,000, but he said the weather's horrendous, but 20,000 is still pretty good. He said, just goes to show, the Scots are a pretty hardy breed, you know. A bit of rain doesn't put them off, thankfully. But he did ask me the question. He said, Alistair, you know, you're the only local Scot here. He said, I just don't understand it. Why isn't Scottish tourism represented? Why isn't Scottish business represented? He said, by any account, this is a really good bunch of people. They're celebrating their Scottish heritage. We've got the old Highland Games, we've got the bagpipes, we've got tons of Scottish flags flying. I said, I know. I said, I don't think I've ever seen as many Scottish flags in one place in my entire life. He said, in fact, I would bet if I counted them up, I went back to Scotland, I said, there's more Scottish flags flying right here than there is in the whole of Scotland. I said, I was just amazed. But yet, no Scottish representation. And some of these games can have from 10,000 to 150,000 and perhaps more. Yet, we don't seem to be wanting to represent it at these, either in tourism or business. I have never understood why we don't. And it's like the chairman said, he said, Alistair, you know me, he said, I'm a multi-millionaire. I run a very successful business operation. But he said, I'm still very proud of my Scottish heritage. And he said, I wish I knew more about Scottish companies, because he said, there may be Scottish companies doing something extraordinary that I could use in my business, but I don't know how to find that information out. And he said there may be other Scottish companies that are selling stuff that I could use personally, and I'd be happy to buy it. But he said, how do you find these Scottish companies? He said, I'm a very busy guy. He said, I don't have a lot of disposable time just to sit looking. In fact, he said, he said, the one thing I tend to do, he said, I do try and read your newsletter every week. But he said, and I said, I don't always have the time to read every issue, but he said, if by any chance you could do a review each week on a Scottish business, I would make an absolute point of reading it, because I'd be interested to know what's going on in Scotland. What did I do? I came back, I contacted umpteen Scottish companies, business organisations, everyone I could possibly think of. No one wanted to know. No one wanted to provide a profile. Now there's the Scots Diaspora for you. They still touch base with the roots, and yet Scotland really ignores them at the end of the day. I mean, I say, shame on Scotland, shame on you local Scots. I mean, I saw a wee video the other day. I really forget who was doing the video, but he did mention that there was this woman, Johnson was her name. She had a big Johnson heritage. This is obviously a prominent family in the borders of Scotland. She took the time and trouble to go for a wee holiday to the borders, go into this local pub, which is right in the heart of the old Johnson lands, and she goes in and she shouts out, I'm a Johnston! Well, obviously a lot of people turn around and look at her, but with a blank expression, like, so? And she was somewhat embarrassed about the whole thing, but also very puzzled. So, well, don't you know this is where the Johnstons came from? We were big in this area. And that's the trouble, you see. The local Scots generally don't know their own history. They don't appreciate it. But it's amazing how the Scots Diaspora has retained that history. But equally well, you hear all the Scots in Scotland moaning about people only think of us as clans and tartans and shortbread and bagpipes. Don't seem to care about what we're doing today. That's absolutely wrong. The Scots Diaspora desperately want to know about what you're doing today, but unfortunately you have found no means of telling us what you're doing today. And I tell you, a common theme you get, like if I'm in a pub in New York, just going in for a drink, talking to some locals. I mean, it doesn't take long before someone mentions, oh, my folks are from the Netherlands, or my folks are from Germany, or my folks are from Spain, or wherever. And before you know it, they're saying, do you know what we're doing in Holland these days? We're doing da-da-da-da-da. Well, I can tell you, I know all what the Scots did in history, but what the Scots are doing today, I know not what. So while they're regaling me about all the modern stories they're doing from their countries, I can't regale them with even one story about Scotland of today, because I don't know, and I don't even know where to go to find that information out. Because, you know, when you're in a country of immigrants, which America is essentially, it's a country of immigrants. People have populated that country by coming from all the countries in the world. It's a common thing that happens. You boast about the country where you came from. But Scotland isn't giving us anything to boast about. It's a shame. But I can tell you, the Scots Diaspora is alive and well. They are an extremely successful group of people. Out of that, do you know, for example, there's something like, I think Scots make up something like 1.7% of the population in America, and yet Scots actually make up 10% of the millionaires in America. We're still successful, even today. So, That's my little story about the Scots Diaspora. I hope you might consider that if you are in the Scots Diaspora, you're extremely proud of being in the Scots Diaspora. I am now living in Canada. I am a Scot, born in Glasgow as it happens, but I now live in Canada. So I'm now part of the Scots Diaspora. Why am I living in Canada? Because my money goes a lot further in Canada and I enjoy living in Canada. It's like I related in another video that I made one time. I sent 3 emails to Alex Salmond, the First Minister of Scotland, and haven't had an acknowledgement or a reply. I sent 3 emails to Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada, and each of those 3 emails has been acknowledged and responded to. So, Stephen Harper 3, Alex Salmond no. But I think that kind of relates the problem that local Scots have in Scotland. They haven't embraced the friends and relations in the diaspora the way they should do, and they're not helping us be proud of what's going on. All we can be proud of is the Scotland of history, and of course that's what my site's all about, is the history. I'd love to tell you more stories about us today, but unfortunately anywhere there's a story, it's usually got a copyright mark against it, and getting permission to use copyright material is rare in the extreme. I think maybe I've got 3 things on the site that are actually in copyright and I've been given permission to use. I'd love to hear more stories from the Scots in the diaspora. Tell me about your experiences, how you came over, stuff like that. I've got a huge section of my site dedicated to the Scots diaspora, and I'd certainly love to hear your stories. And local Scots, all I can say is we're a potent force. We're a very rich force out there in the world. We can help. All you've got to do is get hold of us in the right way and we'll help you make billions of new money for Scotland and the Scots. Thank you for listening.